They called it strategic downsizing. I called it betrayal. After 19 years of building their systems, training their teams, and cleaning up their disasters, they fired me on a Tuesday morning with a 7-minute meeting and a smile that didn't reach their eyes. "Nothing personal," the HR rep said, pushing a paper across the table. "It's just efficiency." Efficiency. That word rang in my ears like a gunshot long after I left the building with a cardboard box full of my life's work. I wasn't angry yet, just hollow. But anger has a way of finding you when you're quiet long enough. You see, I wasn't just any employee. I was the operations architect of the entire logistics framework that kept their billion-dollar empire running. I built the system that predicted shipments, balanced supply chains, and controlled their risk matrix. Every algorithm, every formula, every line of code, they were mine. I had given them everything. And they thought that efficiency meant cutting me loose for a cheaper, faster replacement, someone who didn't understand how delicate the web truly was. They thought I'd disappear quietly. But people forget that the ones who build the systems know exactly where to tug when they want them to fall apart. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't need to. They had done that themselves the moment they replaced me. But I did have a failsafe, something I wrote years ago, buried deep in the operational architecture. It wasn't meant for revenge, it was meant for protection. A hidden contingency that required my credentials every 90 days to renew key integrations between their trading systems and third-party networks. It was meant to prevent breaches if I ever left abruptly, but they forgot to ask about it during my exit. They thought efficiency meant skipping documentation reviews. 3 months later, the first cracks appeared. Their logistics API failed to authenticate at 2:03 a.m. The backups refused to sync. Warehouses stopped receiving updates. Within 12 hours, supply lines stalled across 3 continents. Their automated trading algorithms began triggering unnecessary emergency purchases, millions of dollars in raw materials they couldn't process, contracts they couldn't fulfill. And by the time they realized something was wrong, the system had already flagged itself as compromised, locking them out until an authorized architect validated the network. I was the only one who could. When they called, their tone was very different. The same manager who'd fired me was now speaking through gritted teeth, trying to sound calm. "We think there's been a misunderstanding. We'd like to bring you in as a consultant." I almost laughed. Misunderstanding? No, this was just efficiency, only now they were on the receiving end of it. I didn't say yes or no. I simply reminded them that my consulting fee was 7 times my old salary, payable up front, and that any reactivation would take time. They didn't like it, but they didn't have a choice. Every passing hour cost them millions. By day 3, investors were panicking. The press caught wind of technical irregularities disrupting production. The stock dropped 9% overnight. Their CFO issued a statement assuring everyone that it was a minor operational glitch. Meanwhile, I sat in my small home office, sipping coffee, watching the live ticker bleed red. They called again, this time, their tone desperate. They were losing $40 million per day in frozen contracts and legal penalties. Efficiency, I thought, had never been this expensive. I finally went in on the 4th day. They flew me out first class, of course. The same security guard who once checked my badge now held the door open like I was royalty. I walked into that glass building with the calm of someone who already knows the ending. They gave me a corner office, an emergency access badge, and complete administrative authority. For 12 hours straight, I diagnosed their crisis, pretending to troubleshoot while quietly making copies of every contract, every license, every internal message that documented how they discarded their senior staff in the name of saving costs. I wasn't just restoring their system, I was collecting proof. When I finally brought their network back online, the CEO himself came to shake my hand. "We're glad to have you back," he said with that hollow smile. I met his eyes and replied evenly, "You never had me." He didn't understand at first. He didn't realize that during the crisis, I had re-registered ownership of the system's IP under my consulting firm's name, per clause 14 of the contract they signed in panic. The clause that said all derivative architecture developed during emergency consulting would belong to the consultant. In one stroke, I own the backbone of their $925 million operation. When their lawyers caught on weeks later, it was too late. Every trade, every automated order, every logistic pulse, they all ran through my code. The moment they tried to alter it, the licenses expired. Their entire infrastructure came to a halt again, this time permanently. Investors withdrew. The merger they had been negotiating collapsed overnight. $925 million in projected value, gone. And me? I walked away with full rights to the system that made it all possible. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about respect. About reminding them that efficiency doesn't come from cutting people, it comes from understanding what they've built. When you treat your builders like numbers, don't be surprised when the equations stop balancing. I never raised my voice, never broke a law, never sabotaged a thing. I just let the system do exactly what it was designed to do, protect itself from incompetence. They fired me for efficiency. And in the end, that same efficiency destroyed them. When the dust finally settled, I was sitting in a quiet cafe overlooking the same city where they had once built their empire, towering and arrogant, believing themselves untouchable. I sipped my coffee slowly, scrolling through the headlines that painted their downfall in cold, clinical language. Multinational conglomerate faces record collapse after system ownership dispute. The articles quoted analysts, executives, and legal experts who all danced around the same truth. They didn't understand how a single person could hold that much power. But they never saw the years behind it, the late nights, the weekends sacrificed, the sleepless grind that kept their company alive. They never realized that I had become the company's nervous system, the invisible architect who kept it breathing. When they cut me out in the name of efficiency, they'd severed their own spine. The following weeks were surreal. My phone rang constantly, reporters, lawyers, even rival corporations who wanted to consult with me about their own systems. I declined most of them. Revenge had run its course. I didn't want to rebuild someone else's empire. Not again. But I did agree to one meeting, with a small tech startup that had a single, idealistic goal: building transparent infrastructure that couldn't be weaponized by greed. Their CEO was young, maybe 30, eyes bright with the kind of faith I'd lost years ago. When she spoke about what she wanted to create, I felt something stir in me, not anger this time, but purpose. I decided to invest. Quietly, privately. I didn't need credit or control. I just wanted to help build something honest. My name wouldn't appear on the company's board or in its press releases, but my fingerprints would be there, in every system design, every line of code. A silent architect again, but this time for the right reasons. Meanwhile, the company that fired me was still unraveling. Lawsuits piled up. Their executives turned on each other, and the CEO, the same man who had looked me in the eye and called me obsolete, was ousted by his own board. I read his resignation statement online, a hollow apology wrapped in corporate jargon about unforeseen challenges. It was poetic, in a way. They built their fortune on efficiency, and that very word became their ruin. One morning, months later, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar, the HR manager who had fired me. She hesitated before speaking. I just wanted to say, I didn't know what they were doing. To you, I mean. To people like you. I didn't respond immediately. There was nothing to forgive, not really. The world she lived in had made her that way, efficient, compliant, replaceable. "It's okay," I finally said. "You were just part of the system. I just taught it a lesson." She didn't say anything after that. Just silence, then the faint sound of her exhaling before hanging up. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become a legend in the very circles that once ignored me. Whispers spread about the efficiency architect, the man who brought down a billion-dollar company without ever raising his voice. Some people admired it. Others feared it. I didn't care much for either. What mattered to me was that somewhere, in boardrooms across the world, executives were now thinking twice before cutting the people who held their systems together. Late one evening, as I stood on my balcony watching the city glow beneath the rain, I realized something. I hadn't destroyed them out of vengeance. I'd destroyed them out of necessity. Because every empire built on exploitation eventually collapses under its own arrogance. I just gave gravity a little push. I turned off my phone, closed my laptop, and let the rain fall. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. They fired me for efficiency. But I was never inefficient. I was the only one who knew how to make their world work. And now that it had fallen, I finally felt something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The night air was cool, carrying that quiet hum of the city that never truly sleeps, engines in the distance, the rhythmic patter of rain on glass, a world still spinning while one man's silence had rewritten its rules. I leaned against the railing and thought about all those years, about the meetings that ran too long, the praise that never came, the way they'd called me part of the furniture. I had once believed in their dream, that hard work would protect you, that loyalty was currency. But loyalty meant nothing when profit margins dipped below expectations. Efficiency was just a polite word for cutting throats quietly. I'd spent 23 years building their digital ecosystem from the ground up, databases, compliance networks, logistics, automation. They thought the system ran itself, like some self-sustaining miracle. But it was me. Always me. Every safeguard, every patch, every workaround that kept them from imploding under their own incompetence. When they pushed me out, I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't hack, I didn't destroy. I simply reclaimed what was mine. The licenses, the frameworks, the proprietary algorithms that were still under my name, intellectual property I had written before they ever owned it. When I revoked their access, the system didn't explode, it just stopped breathing. Like pulling the plug on a machine that had forgotten it was alive. For a while, I wondered if I had gone too far. Watching an empire crumble carries a certain weight. Thousands of people lost jobs. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. They were already being replaced, downsized, outsourced. I hadn't created their collapse, I had only accelerated it. The rot was already there, spreading from the inside out. They were just too blinded by arrogance to notice. Months later, I ran into one of my old engineers at a conference. He recognized me instantly. His expression was a strange mix of guilt and admiration. "You know," he said quietly, "we still use your framework. The startups, I mean. The open source version. You built something that actually lasts." That struck me harder than I expected. Amid all the destruction, something good had survived, a version of my work that couldn't be owned, couldn't be corrupted by greed. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud. Maybe revenge wasn't just about making someone pay. Maybe it was about balance. Restoring what had been taken, dignity, credit, respect, and leaving behind something better than what was destroyed. The company that fired me would never recover. Their assets were being auctioned off piece by piece, and their CEO was nowhere to be found. Some said he'd fled the country, others said he was negotiating immunity. I didn't care to know. He'd built his empire on the backs of others and called it genius. When it fell, he blamed the weather, the economy, bad luck, everything but the truth. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the city lights blurring into gold and gray. In that reflection, I saw what they never could, a man who had given everything to something that never deserved it. And now, I wasn't angry anymore. The fight was over. The lesson had been taught. I wasn't the villain of their story, though they'd surely paint me as one. I was simply the correction, the necessary error that forces a system to reboot. And as I watched the headlines fade and the world move on, I realized that maybe that's all any of us can be. A quiet reminder that even in a world obsessed with efficiency, humanity still has the final say. I finished my coffee, turned off the lights, and walked away from the window. Tomorrow, I'd start fresh, not rebuilding what was lost, but creating something new. Something they could never own or fire or replace. Because they taught me the most important lesson of all: sometimes, to fix the system, you have to let it crash first. In the months that followed, I kept a low profile. No interviews, no comments, no public appearances. Let them guess. Let them spin their own narratives about the ghost in their servers, the man who vanished just before their empire crumbled. The rumors were almost poetic, that I'd fled to Switzerland, that I'd been bought out by a rival firm, that I'd gone insane. The truth was simpler and far less cinematic. I was home. Sleeping well. Breathing deeply for the first time in decades. But revenge, even when justified, has echoes. The collapse had triggered investigations that stretched across continents. Regulators began digging into their accounting, discovering shell companies, hidden assets, falsified sustainability reports. Every new revelation was another thread pulled loose, unraveling what they'd worked so hard to protect. And at the center of it all, the same phrase kept appearing in the leaked memos: efficiency restructuring. That single corporate euphemism had destroyed thousands of lives, and now it was eating its own. I'd kept copies of everything, of course. Emails, drafts, timestamps, contracts with my signature still attached. I'd handed them quietly to an independent journalist I trusted, someone who did no favors to billionaires. When the exposé finally broke, it wasn't about revenge or sabotage. It was about truth. It laid bare how greed had infected every decision, how executives had traded long-term stability for quarterly bonuses, how they'd fired the very people who held their fragile empire together. The fallout was brutal. Stocks plummeted. Investors withdrew. The CEO, the same man who had called me an operational redundancy, was subpoenaed within a week. Watching him on television, stammering through evasive answers under oath, was almost surreal. His eyes looked smaller somehow. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was a hollow man who'd mistaken cruelty for strength. Still, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. Because deep down, I knew something important: this wasn't just their punishment. It was my closure. I had spent too many years chasing validation from people who would never give it. I had believed that if I just worked harder, stayed later, delivered more, I'd be irreplaceable. But no one is irreplaceable to those who see humans as numbers on a spreadsheet. The only real power comes when you stop asking for permission to matter. One evening, as I walked through the park near my home, I saw a group of young engineers sitting on benches, laptops open, debating code. They were building something new, lean, clever, independent. One of them recognized me and nodded, half smiling. "You're the guy from the story, right? The one who crashed his company." I laughed softly. "I built it first," I said. "Crashing it was just debugging." He grinned. "Well, your old framework runs half our system now. Open source. Clean, efficient." That word, efficient, no longer sounded like an insult. It sounded like redemption. Because this time, efficiency wasn't about profit margins or cutting people out. It was about purpose. About doing more with honesty, not less with greed. As I walked away, I realized something that stayed with me ever since. Revenge doesn't have to end in destruction. Sometimes it ends in creation, in reclaiming what was lost, in making something better, freer, untethered by the hands that once controlled it. They fired me for efficiency. And in doing so, they gave me the freedom to define what it truly meant. Now, every time I see another corporation boast about their restructuring, I can't help but smile. Because somewhere in their code, in their infrastructure, in the invisible veins of their systems, there's a quiet warning written by people like me, a reminder that no empire built on arrogance lasts forever. And sometimes, all it takes is one fired employee with a memory and a conscience to bring it all down. The years went by quietly after that. I built a small consultancy, deliberately keeping it modest, no investors, no inflated titles, just a handful of people who believed in doing things right. We didn't chase scale. We chased precision. Our clients came to us not because we promised miracles, but because they'd seen what happens when integrity is replaced by ego. Ironically, many of those same corporations that once ignored me began hiring my firm to fix the messes left behind by their own efficiency experts. I didn't turn them away. I just made sure they paid fairly, and that they learned something in the process. Sometimes, during late nights at my new office, I'd scroll through old files just to remind myself how it all began. The memos, the performance reports, the email where my CEO had coldly typed, "We're moving in a more efficient direction, and unfortunately, that no longer includes you." I used to feel anger reading that line, now it just made me smirk. Because I finally understood that being efficient in their eyes meant being obedient. Replaceable. Predictable. And I had never been any of those things. One day, a former colleague, Laura, came to visit. She'd been one of the few who defended me during the layoffs, though it cost her a promotion. "You heard about them, right?" she asked as we sat across from each other, coffee steaming between us. "They're filing for bankruptcy. The last of the assets are being liquidated." I nodded. I had heard, I'd even seen the auction list. "It's strange," she continued, "how fast things fall apart once you remove the wrong piece." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "They didn't remove the wrong piece," I said softly. "They just never realized it was the only one holding the whole thing together." She smiled then, a slow, knowing smile. "You know, there's talk that the regulators want you to consult for the inquiry." I shook my head. "No, I've told my story. It's time for new voices." But deep inside, I knew that my fingerprints were already all over that chapter of corporate history. Not out of ego, but out of truth, a living lesson that others would study for years to come. On my walk home that evening, the sun was setting low over the skyline, painting the glass towers in soft amber light. For a moment, I saw my reflection in one of them, older now, more lines on my face, but lighter somehow. The man who had once been broken by a firing was gone. In his place stood someone reborn from the wreckage, someone who had learned that destruction can be a kind of creation when it's done in the name of justice. A thought crossed my mind then, not bitter, not triumphant, just simple and true. They had fired me for efficiency. But what they never understood was that I was efficiency, not the kind that cuts corners or erases people, but the kind that builds systems strong enough to last. So I walked on, letting the city fade behind me, my shadow stretching long across the pavement. Somewhere, in another boardroom, another CEO was probably giving the same speech mine once gave, about progress, productivity, and the need to streamline. Maybe one day, they'd remember my name when their servers froze, when their systems faltered, when their carefully stacked house of glass finally cracked under its own weight. And if they didn't? That was fine too. Because I'd already made peace with the truth. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't in watching them fall. It's in walking away, knowing you were the foundation all along, and that the moment they let you go, their collapse became inevitable. Weeks later, I found myself back in the city where it all began. The skyline hadn't changed, same towers of mirrored arrogance, same streets buzzing with ambition and exhaustion. I stood across from the building that once held my old office. It was empty now, stripped bare, windows dark. A faded sign still clung to the side of the building, the company's logo peeling like old paint. The empire they built on efficiency had become another abandoned monument to greed. I walked inside. The lobby was silent, the marble floors still polished but empty of footsteps. Dust caught the afternoon light like slow-moving ghosts. I took the elevator up to the 20th floor, where my office used to be. The doors opened to a gutted floor, no desks, no monitors, just the faint echo of the life I used to live. I could almost hear the faint hum of servers, the sound of fingers typing, the dull chatter of late-night strategy sessions. And beneath all that, I could hear my own voice, the man I once was, too loyal to question, too blind to see what was coming. I stood at the window where I'd once watched the city lights and dreamed about being part of something bigger. Back then, I thought loyalty was the price of belonging. But standing there now, older and freer, I realized belonging isn't about serving others' power, it's about owning your purpose. They had fired me to save money. I had taught them the cost of underestimating the hands that built their world. As I turned to leave, I saw something faintly etched into the paint on the far wall, a patch of cleaner white where my nameplate used to hang. For a moment, I smiled. It felt like the end of a chapter, not with bitterness, but with peace. I had already written the next one. Outside, a young man stood on the curb, holding a coffee cup and staring at the building. He looked nervous, maybe just starting his career. He glanced at me and said, "You used to work here, didn't you?" "I did," I said. He hesitated, then asked, "Is it true what they say? That one guy brought the whole company down?" I looked back at the empty building, the reflection of the city dancing across its glass facade like a mirage. "No," I said quietly. "The company brought itself down. The guy just stopped holding it up." He nodded, eyes wide, as if he understood more than he should have. Then he walked away, his footsteps fading into the sound of traffic. I stood there for a moment longer, watching the sunset spill over the skyline, painting everything gold, a color too pure for what those towers once represented. I breathed in the cool air, felt the weight of the years settle and lift all at once. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was resolution. Because the truth is, when they fired me, they thought they were cutting costs. What they actually did was cut their own future loose. They thought efficiency was about numbers. I knew it was about balance, between people, purpose, and progress. Now, I work quietly, teaching young engineers, mentoring teams that build things to last. I tell them my story sometimes, not as a warning, but as proof that endings can be beginnings if you face them with clarity instead of anger. I tell them to guard their work, protect their names, and never give blind loyalty to anyone who treats them like a replaceable cog. Because I learned the hard way, the most efficient act of all is knowing when to walk away, and when to let a broken system collapse under the weight of its own lies. As I turned and walked toward the fading sun, I realized something I'd never noticed before. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. As I walked away from that building for the last time, the city felt strangely alive in a way it hadn't in years. The air smelled of rain and streetlights, the sounds of cars and footsteps blending into something almost musical. Every corner, every flickering neon sign seemed to whisper the same thing: "You're free now." I didn't have to be the man behind someone else's dream anymore. I could finally build something that reflected who I was, not what I was told to be. A few months later, I moved into a smaller office across town, nothing fancy, Just a quiet space with big windows and a door that stayed open. I named my firm Atlas Node Systems, after the idea that if you bear the weight of the world too long, it's okay to set it down and let the world balance itself. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who once called me obsolete were now reaching out for advice on how to rebuild what they had broken. I didn't hold grudges. I just named my price. Every so often, I'd receive an email from someone who had been laid off during the efficiency purge. Some were still struggling, others had found their own paths. But there was a pattern in their words: gratitude. Not for the pain they'd endured, but for what it had forced them to see, that stability is an illusion when it's built on exploitation. One of them, a young analyst named Priya, wrote to me saying, "They fired me thinking they were cutting costs. They just cut away everything that was holding them up." I smiled reading that. She got it. The next generation would not be as naive as we had been. The collapse of the company became a case study, the Halden efficiency disaster, they called it in business journals. They analyzed it endlessly: the management failures, the overdependence on legacy systems, the ignored warnings. My name appeared in footnotes and speculation pieces, but I never gave a statement. Some things don't need to be explained. Let the facts speak. Years later, at a technology conference, I was invited to speak on a panel about corporate resilience. I hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. When I took the stage, the audience fell quiet, not out of awe, but curiosity. They wanted to hear the story from the man who'd supposedly brought down an empire. I smiled and said, "They call it revenge. I call it consequence." I told them that resilience isn't built by cutting people, it's built by trusting them. That efficiency doesn't mean fewer hands, it means smarter hearts. That when you fire the people who remember how things really work, you're not saving money, you're setting fire to your foundation. The room stayed silent, the kind of silence that means you've hit something real. When it ended, a young CEO came up to me, probably no older than 30, and said, "I think I'm making some of the same mistakes." I looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Then you still have time to stop." He nodded slowly, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, maybe guilt, maybe understanding. Either way, the message had landed. That night, walking back through the rain, I thought about how revenge stories often end with fire and fury, but mine didn't. Mine ended with quiet truth. I didn't burn their company down out of hate, I just stopped holding up their lie. The world took care of the rest. And as I turned the corner, watching the city lights blur in the drizzle, I realized that maybe that's all real justice ever is, not punishment, but balance restored. I wasn't the villain they painted me to be. I wasn't the hero either. I was just the missing line of code, the one that, once deleted, made the system crash and finally reveal what it really was all along. A hollow shell of its own arrogance. I smiled, hands in my pockets, and kept walking, not toward revenge, not toward redemption, but toward something far rarer: peace. Years later, when I look back on it all, the firing, the collapse, the sleepless nights spent deciding whether to fight back or move on, I don't see chaos anymore. I see clarity. I see the moment the illusion broke, when I finally understood that loyalty without respect is just servitude. They taught me that lesson the hard way, but I'm grateful they did. Because without that fall, I never would have learned how to rise. The company's name is a ghost now, a footnote in corporate history books under strategic mismanagement. The CEO who called me inefficient took a consulting job overseas, pretending the failure wasn't his fault. But those who knew, the engineers, the analysts, the assistants who watched it all burn from the inside, they remember. And sometimes, that's all the justice you need. Not applause, not headlines, but quiet acknowledgement from those who saw the truth unfold. I still get emails from journalists asking for interviews, or from startups wanting to license my newer systems. Most of the time, I politely decline. I'm not chasing legacy anymore. I already have one, written not in money or awards, but in lessons learned and bridges rebuilt. My small firm is thriving. Not massive, not flashy, but honest. People matter here. Ideas matter here. We build things that last, not because they're profitable, but because they're right. Every now and then, I drive past that old headquarters. The building's been converted into a shared workspace now, glass cleaned, lights on again, laughter echoing from the lobby. I don't feel anger when I see it. Just peace. Because life has a way of recycling even the ruins. Something new always grows where arrogance used to stand. They fired me for efficiency. But I realize now, that was never an insult. It was prophecy. Because nothing is more efficient than truth, it cuts cleanly, swiftly, without waste. And when the lies collapsed under their own weight, all I did was let gravity do its job. I don't think of what I did as revenge anymore. It was balance. A quiet correction to a system that had forgotten the value of the people who built it. The company is gone, but the story remains, whispered in boardrooms, studied in business schools, retold by those who think they're untouchable. And if there's one lesson I leave behind, it's this: never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake decency for compliance. And never forget, when you build your empire on the backs of others, you're standing on borrowed ground. Because the moment you forget that, the people you dismissed as inefficient might just be the ones holding up your entire world.